In The Purloined Letter, the third of Edgar Allan Poe's mystery tales, his detective, Auguste Dupin, does something quite cruel. The prefect of the Parisian police has just finished telling Dupin about the ridiculously painstaking and unsuccessful search he has conducted for the missing letter. The Minister D is suspected of having stolen the letter, and in his efforts to recover it and claim a large reward, the prefect has searched not only every square inch of the minister's house, but also the houses on either side. Frustrated and exhausted, the prefect has come to Dupin for advice, and Dupin advises him to research the premises. Why is this advice so cruel? Because Dupin already knows that the prefect's second search, just like his first, will end in failure. So why does Dupin give the prefect this useless advice? Partly because, by the time the prefect returns to Dupin, even more frustrated and desperate, the reward for the missing letter, which Dupin now has in his possession, will have increased considerably, and so Dupin can enrich himself by returning the letter and claiming the reward. But the main reason that Dupin has the prefect conduct a second, useless search is that he delights in tormenting the prefect, for whom he has no respect whatsoever. This incident, in other words, demonstrates the fact that in mystery and suspense fiction, the police and the detective figure often have an antagonistic, even hostile relationship with each other. But why is this? Aren't the police and the detective on the same side? Aren't they both dedicated to fighting crime, capturing the bad guys, and restoring order? Technically, yes, but their methods of doing so can be so different that in many examples of the genre, the detective and the police are antagonists rather than collaborators. This lecture will take a closer look at the complexities of this apparently straightforward relationship in order to show how the contrast with the police can be one of the main ways in which we come to understand the peculiar personality, methods, and motives of the detective. As I've already indicated, the work of Edgar Allan Poe is a great place to begin this investigation, because the antagonistic relationship between Dupin and the police is present in his very first mystery tale, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. When Dupin asks the narrator for his opinion about the murders, the narrator states that he agrees with all Paris that they are an insoluble mystery. Dupin, obviously, disagrees, and is particularly critical of the police investigation, saying, "The Parisian police, so much extolled for acumen, are cunning, but no more. There is no method in their proceedings beyond the method of the moment." After criticizing the police for their lack of method, Dupin goes on to admit that the police do occasionally achieve results, but even this faint praise is accompanied by further criticism. The results attained by them are not unfrequently surprising, but for the most part are brought about by simple diligence and activity. When these qualities are unavailing, their schemes fail. The picture of the police that emerges from Dupin's comments is a group that is busy and diligent, but also dull and unimaginative. Not actively malevolent like the criminal, the police are instead ineffective and slow. But the importance of Dupin's comments goes beyond simply telling us what the detective thinks about the police. They also serve as a kind of guide to understanding what defines the detective and his methods. If the police are often busy and active just for the sake of it, the detective, as personified by Dupin, chooses carefully when to be active. If the police are unimaginative and have a tendency to apply the same set of methods to every case, no matter what the circumstances, then the detective's methods will be characterized by imagination, creativity, flexibility, and variety. There can be no better demonstration of Dupin's ability to think outside the box than the fact that he goes on to deduce that the murders were committed by an escaped orangutan. There has been much critical speculation about why Poe chose such an unlikely murderer for his first mystery tale. One major reason is that this bizarre choice allows Poe to show his reader how the work of analysis is more creative and imaginative than the stolid, predictable, and unsuccessful work of the police. Just as importantly, both Poe and Dupin are at pains to stress that Dupin's success is the product of a method, rather than being a result of intuition, a hunch, or a lucky guess. The police may be methodical, but in this context, that word is almost a criticism. What the detective does is to combine method with imagination, and the resulting activity of analysis is the key to the detective's success. Poe uses the police in his first mystery tale to provide a point of contrast with his detective figure. Mindful of the novelty of a character like Dupin, Poe uses the police to represent the ordinary in order to underline how extraordinary his detective is. Small wonder, then, that at the end of the Rue Morgue case, apart from having solved what was considered to be an insoluble crime, Dupin derives his main satisfaction from having beaten the prefect, or, in his own words, having defeated him in his own castle. This competitive relationship between the detective and the police comes back in the purloined letter. Only in this case, the stakes are somewhat higher in the form of a very large reward. As in the other Dupin tales, the detective's motives for solving the case are a combination of several factors, including the desire for monetary gain, the intellectual challenge, and the desire to help others. But in the purloined letter case, Dupin is also motivated by the desire to teach the prefect a lesson. Where does this desire come from? When the prefect comes to Dupin and tells him about the case, they discuss the suspect, the Minister D, at length. Generally, we might assume that detective and the police have a lot in common. But in this instance, the detective actually has more in common with the criminal. Dupin and the minister are both highly educated, extremely cultured, and consider themselves to be superior to their peers. At one point in their conversation, Dupin comments to the prefect that the minister is by no means a fool, and therefore should not be underestimated. The prefect replies by saying, "But then he's a poet, which I take to be only one remove from a fool." What happens next is a delicious detail that is easily overlooked, but is crucial to understanding both Dupin's treatment of the prefect and the relationship between the detective and the police. In response to the prefect's comment, Dupin says, "True, although I have been guilty of certain doggerel myself." If the prefect had an ounce of sense, as soon as he finds out that Dupin writes poetry, he would apologize to Dupin for insulting him. But the dim-witted and self-involved prefect doesn't even notice his blunder. Poe's reader does notice it, however, and so we now know that Dupin has a good reason, at least in his own mind, to torment the prefect. Now let's go back to the incident we discussed earlier, in which Dupin advises the prefect to search the minister's house again. We now realize that Dupin is motivated not only by a desire to increase the reward, but also by a desire to torture the prefect, perhaps for insulting him earlier in the story. And this is another example of a crucial detail that is easy to overlook. We need to consider the meaning of the exact words Dupin uses when he gives the prefect his advice. He doesn't say, "Search the house again." Instead, he says, "Make a thorough research of the premises." The prefect, being the unimaginative character he is, assumes that the word premises refers to the minister's house. In fact, Dupin is using the word in a more abstract sense, to refer to the principles the prefect is using when conducting his search. In other words, Dupin is ironically giving the prefect very good advice. If you want to find the letter, you need to proceed from a different set of premises, a different set of principles and assumptions, just as Dupin will do. Once again, the police are condemned, not because they're bad, but because they're stupid and unimaginative. Or as Dupin puts it, when explaining to the narrator why the prefect failed to find the letter. The measures were good in their kind and well executed, their defect lay in their being inapplicable to the case and to the man. Dupin is stressing the need for creativity and imagination, rather than the mindless application of the same method to every situation, regardless of the circumstances. As with so many other aspects of Poe's foundational mystery tales, his characterization of the police and his description of the relationship between the police and the detective would both have a profound influence on later examples of the genre. However, neither of these aspects of Poe's work was simply adopted uncritically by later writers, and we can see evidence of this if we now turn to the work of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie. Even though Sherlock Holmes and Auguste Dupin have many things in common, including their eccentricity, arrogance, and intelligence, Doyle's character is notably more generous toward the police than Dupin. Part of the reason for this difference undoubtedly has to do with changes that took place between the 1840s, when Poe was writing his mystery tales, and the late 19th century, when Sherlock Holmes appeared. Policing, in the modern sense of the word, that is, the establishment of a centralized, independent, 24-hour and preventive police presence, dates back to 1829 in London. This same model was later adopted by American cities, such as Philadelphia in 1833, Boston in 1838, and New York City in 1844. So when Poe wrote Rue Morgue in 1841, the police were a relatively new phenomenon, and were still viewed with some degree of skepticism by most Americans. By the time Sherlock Holmes first appeared in A Study in Scarlet in 1887, the police force were not only a well-established presence in Great Britain, but also had a reputation for being reliable and effective. Even if Doyle, who in practice held rather conservative social and political views, had been inclined to portray the police as bumbling idiots, it's likely that his readers would have rejected such a portrayal as being unrealistic. With this in mind, it becomes easier to understand a character like Inspector Lestrade. Despite the fact that Lestrade's a police detective and therefore, from Holmes's point of view, inherently limited, Holmes frequently comments to Watson that Lestrade is the best detective at Scotland Yard. Although this is an example of damning with faint praise, the fact that Doyle kept bringing this character back, he makes 13 appearances in total, the first in 1887 and the last in 1924, testifies both to his reliability and to the unavoidable presence of the police as an entity in mystery and suspense fiction written during this period. Still, I don't want to give the impression that Holmes is a big fan of the police. It would be more accurate to say that, unlike Dupin, Holmes recognizes that the police can be useful on occasion, and he's willing to include them in his cases when he deems it necessary to do so. For example, in The Red-Headed League, Holmes sets a trap for John Clay, a dangerous and skilled bank robber, in the basement of a bank in London. While the preparations are underway, Doyle gives us an amusing glimpse of what the police think of Holmes. Jones, the Scotland Yard detective who appears in this story, says of Holmes, "He has his own little methods, which are, if you won't mind my saying so, just a little too theoretical and fantastic. But he has the makings of a detective in him. It's not too much to say that once or twice he has been more nearly correct than the official force." This comment is a wonderful example of grudging praise. Can you imagine anything more tortured than the phrase, "more nearly correct"? But Jones's remarks do give the reader a very good sense of how frustrating it must be for the police to constantly be shown up and outdone by someone like Holmes. And just in case you were wondering how Holmes might react to a policeman saying that he has the makings of a detective in him, there's a wonderful incident in The Adventure of the Speckled Band, when Dr. Grimsby Roylott, the villain in this particular story, bursts into Holmes's rooms, hurls a string of insults and threats at him, and then storms out. Readers are likely to laugh out loud when they realize that the insult that stung Holmes the most was when Roylott describes him as Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack-in-Office. As Holmes complains to Watson after Roylott leaves, "Fancy his having the insolence to confound me with the official detective force." Returning to the Red-Headed League. If Holmes has a rather dim view of the police, why does he take Jones with him when they go hunting for John Clay? Doyle makes sure that Holmes explains his reasoning to Watson. He's not a bad fellow, but an absolute imbecile in his profession. He has one positive virtue. He is as brave as a bulldog and as tenacious as a lobster if he gets his claws upon anyone. This is a perfect example of the extent to which Holmes is willing to praise a member of the police, and it's not something we could imagine Dupin saying about the prefect. Holmes acknowledges the mental limitations of Jones, but at the same time he's careful not to understate the importance of bravery and determination. This same combination of admiration for what the police do well and criticism of their limitations can also be found in Agatha Christie's work. In the ABC murders, for example, Captain Hastings frequently criticizes Hercule Poirot for what he perceives as Poirot's inactivity during their search for what appears to be a serial killer. Poirot defends himself in two ways. First, Poirot points out, quite correctly of course, that his characteristic activity is mental, whereas what Hastings is referring to is busy physical activity that ultimately will do nothing to solve the case. Second, Poirot points out that all the physical, that is, more mundane aspects of the investigation are being taken care of by the police. But what is it you would have me do, my friend? The routine inquiries. The police make them better than I do. Always, you want me to run about like the dog. Like Holmes, Poirot allows that the police do have a role to play, albeit a rather limited one. But there are also clear limits to the police's utility. This is why, at another point in the novel, when a character asks Poirot if he is from the police, he says, unambiguously, "I am better than the police." What does Poirot mean? Even if his relationship with the police is not as antagonistic as that of Dupin, Poirot still insists on a clear difference between the detective and the official police force. The police might be useful, they can even help the detective in a small way, but there's never any doubt about the fact that it's the detective and only the detective who will solve the case successfully. In the ABC murders, this point is driven home when the police arrest and charge a suspect who's obviously guilty. He's even confessed. The police are satisfied, but Poirot is not. Why? Despite all the physical evidence pointing to this man's guilt, Poirot cannot believe that he's psychologically capable of committing the crimes he's been charged with. Working from this basis, which the police conveniently ignore because it doesn't serve their purposes, Poirot is able to discover the identity of the real killer, and the innocent man is released. In this way, Christie suggests why the difference between the detective and the police matters. It's not just about competition or antagonism. The detective's superiority to the police, his ability to add another dimension to the mundane investigative abilities of the police, ensures that justice is done and order restored. If we now move from the classical mystery fiction of Doyle and Christie to the hard-boiled crime fiction of Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, and Mickey Spillane, we might expect the antagonistic relationship between the detective and the police to be set to one side, just as the hard-boiled revolution in the genre rejected so many of the defining elements of the English mystery. But that's not what happens. Although the nature of and the reasons for the antagonism change somewhat, the antagonism itself persists for reasons we'll discuss a little later. First, though, let's look at some of the forms that the antagonism between the detective and the police takes in hard-boiled crime fiction. One thing that stands out immediately is that hard-boiled private eyes tend to have a much closer relationship to law enforcement than detectives like Dupin, Holmes, and Poirot. Although we know very little about Sam Spade's life before he became a private eye, his friendship with cop Tom Polhouse in The Maltese Falcon, along with his familiarity with police procedure, both suggest at least the possibility that Spade worked for law enforcement before becoming self-employed. Similarly, we know from The Big Sleep that Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe at one time worked for the local DA's office before starting up on his own. Moreover, Marlowe's friendship with Bernie Olds, his former colleague, like Spade's friendship with Polhouse, suggests that the private eye doesn't always automatically have an antagonistic relationship with the police. Indeed, in some cases, the private eye can actually have a very friendly, even collaborative relationship with the police. We see this very clearly, if somewhat unexpectedly, in I, the Jury, Mickey Spillane's first Mike Hammer novel. Mike Hammer works hand in hand with the police detective Pat Chambers as they try to solve the murder of Hammer's friend, Jack Williams. Being a firm supporter of law and order, Hammer has more respect for the police than any other private eye. He both admires their resources and has sympathy for the difficulties of their job. In fact, it would be no exaggeration to say that Hammer, as stubborn and bullheaded as he is, realizes that to some extent he needs to rely on the police to get his job done, a realization that would seemingly preclude an antagonistic relationship with the police. And yet, the antagonism remains. While Spade and Polhouse are friends, Spade and Polhouse's colleague, Lieutenant Dundee, absolutely loathe each other, and Polhouse has a full-time job trying to separate them. When he's called into the DA's office to be questioned, the normally tight-lipped Spade devotes one of the longest speeches in the entire novel to explaining why he's not going to cooperate with him. Similarly, despite his friendship with Olds, Marlowe is usually uncooperative with the police, ostensibly out of loyalty to his client, but at least partly because he neither respects nor likes law enforcement as an institution. And even Mike Hammer, despite his friendship with Pat Chambers, makes no bones about the fact that they're in competition over finding Jack Williams' killer. In Hammer's words, "From now on, it's a race. I want the killer for myself. We'll work together as usual, but in the home stretch, I'm going to pull the trigger." Hammer, ever a man of his word, keeps his promise to avenge his friend by killing his murderer. Although getting justice for Jack Williams is undoubtedly Hammer's main motivation in this case, it's safe to say he also takes some satisfaction from beating Pat Chambers to the punch. Why has the antagonism between the police and the detective remained such a stable part of hard-boiled crime fiction when that genre eagerly overturned so much of what came before it? The answer, I think, can be found by recognizing what the classical detective and the private eye, despite all their differences, have in common with each other: their independence and their individualism. Beginning with Auguste Dupin, the detective figure has always tended to be something of an outsider. This means not only that it's difficult for him to form emotional attachments with others, but also it's extremely unlikely that this figure could work easily or comfortably within the limits of a large organization. Whether we're talking about the classical versions of this figure, such as Dupin, Holmes, and Poirot, or their hard-boiled counterparts, such as Spade, Marlowe, and Hammer, the detective figure works best alone. Why? Partly because many varieties of mystery and suspense fiction, despite the genre's apparent cynicism about human nature, actually have quite a romantic and idealistic side that expresses itself in the belief that one person can make a difference. Perhaps because the world around us suggests the opposite, readers of mystery and suspense fiction are attracted to the idea that the eccentric outsider, with their own individual moral and ethical code to which they cling tenaciously, can take a stand against everything that's wrong in the world. The detective has come to personify our emotional attachment to the idea of the uncompromised individual, while the police, for better or worse, have come to personify the collective, the organization, with all its negative attributes of callousness, inefficiency, and bureaucracy. That is why the antagonism between police and detective is so persistent, although, as we will see in another lecture, in some types of mystery and suspense fiction, the collective aspects of law enforcement are viewed positively. In closing, I would like to discuss an example of the antagonistic relationship between the detective and the police in mystery and suspense fiction that could be said to cross a line. Let me explain. Up to this point, detective characters have criticized the police for a number of reasons, including their inflexibility, their stupidity, and the limitations imposed on them by the fact that they have to respect the letter of the law, no matter how illogical that law might be. But none of the writers we've looked at have gone so far as to suggest that the police might be antagonistic in a much more basic sense, that is, by being malevolent, by being the criminal. Given mystery and suspense fiction's endless appetite for innovation and change, it should come as no surprise that the genre can supply us with examples of criminal police officers. In The Killer Inside Me, Jim Thompson comes up with a particularly creative way to blend the categories of police officer and criminal by making them the same person. Lou Ford is a deputy sheriff in a small town in Texas, and as such, is supposedly there to either prevent crime or capture and punish the criminal. In fact, Ford himself is the criminal, responsible for a series of murders over the course of the book that, at least in some cases, he is involved in investigating. Thanks to Thompson's use of first-person narration, the reader gets a vivid sense of what it feels like for Ford to occupy these diametrically opposed identities simultaneously. Just before Lou kills Johnny Pappas in order to prevent information about his previous crimes coming out, Lou explains to Johnny what has happened to him. I guess I kind of got a foot on both fences, Johnny. I planted them there early, and now they've taken root. And I can't move either way, and I can't jump. All I can do is wait until I split right down the middle. In Lou Ford, the antagonism between detective and criminal is focused in a single body and expresses a split in Lou's personality. In this way, Thompson finds a very imaginative way to give new life to a well-established tension in the genre. But there's more at stake here for Thompson than diagnosing an individual character with a psychological condition. Inasmuch as Lou Ford is a police officer, for Thompson, he also represents authority and power in a world that in Thompson's eyes has gone badly wrong. As Ford puts it to Johnny, "We're living in a funny world, kid, a peculiar civilization. The police are playing crooks in it, and the crooks are doing police duty." In Thompson's deft hands, what began in Poe's work as a way of distinguishing the novel figure of the detective from the police has now become a tool to dissect and analyze social ills. In this way, mystery and suspense fiction once again demonstrates its variety and depth.